Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back into a quieter, stranger corner of royal history. So if you're curled up under the blankets, or lying there with your phone glowing softly in the dark, let's set the mood. Imagine a time when power was absolute, crowns were heavy, and, unfortunately for the royal offspring, family misfortune usually meant your bedtime story was less happily ever after and more disappeared into a tower. Because when kings lost their crowns, their children rarely got happy endings. They became bargaining chips, political hostages, or in the best case scenario, deeply awkward house guests at a distant relative's castle. Tonight we'll drift through their fates, one by one, with all the dignity, melodrama, and faint smell of damp medieval stonework that history can offer. So, let's settle in and start with one of the most famous "oops, what do we do with the kids now?" situations in history. The princes in the tower. You probably know this one already, because it's practically the poster child of royal child disappearances. We're in England, 1483. King Edward IV dies unexpectedly, leaving behind two young sons. The eldest, Edward V, was just 12 years old, and his little brother Richard was 9. They were supposed to be crowned and rule in due time. Instead, their uncle Richard, yes, that Richard, the one Shakespeare later decided to give a hunched back and a villain laugh, took custody of them. He placed them in the Tower of London, which sounds ominous, but at the time was technically the royal residence as well as a prison. Of course, people noticed fairly quickly that the boys went in, and then stopped being seen at all. Rumors swirled. Were they smothered? Starved? Spirited away? Nobody ever proved anything, though bones of two young children were later found under a staircase. They were hastily reburied, because the English are nothing if not practical when confronted with skeletons in inconvenient places. The thing is, Richard probably didn't even need to kill them. He'd already declared them illegitimate on the grounds that their father had a prior marriage contract, something medieval kings loved pulling out of thin air when politically convenient. But because the boys disappeared, Richard became forever remembered as the evil uncle. And as for the children themselves, their story simply vanishes into the stone walls of the tower, leaving behind one of history's first truly viral missing persons case, a tragic bedtime story that still unsettles 5 centuries later. The Romanov children. Now, if the Tower Princes are the medieval prototype, the Romanov children of Russia are the modern equivalent. Let's float forward to 1917. Tsar Nicholas II had managed to stumble his way through war, revolution, and general incompetence until finally the empire had had enough. He was forced to abdicate. That left not only Nicholas himself, but also his wife Alexandra and their 5 children. 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and one frail hemophiliac son, Alexei. They were moved from palace to palace under house arrest, always shadowed by guards. Now the Romanov daughters were raised with a strange mix of privilege and strictness. Their mother, Alexandra, was convinced luxury would spoil them. So they had to make their own clothes, sleep on hard camp beds, and take cold baths. Very character building, though perhaps less useful when your entire empire is collapsing. In July 1918, they were moved into the basement of a house in Yekaterinburg, officially for their safety. Unofficially, it was the end of the line. In one of history's grimmer finales, the family was executed by Bolshevik guards. The children were caught in the crossfire, confused, terrified, and tragically armored in hidden jewels sewn into their clothing, which deflected bullets but prolonged the ordeal. For decades, rumors persisted, especially around Anastasia. Countless young women across Europe claimed to be the lost princess, which was usually more about free meals and attention than actual evidence. DNA testing in the 1990s finally confirmed the remains were real. All 5 children had been killed that night. So, while bedtime stories like to end with "the princess escaped," the Romanov girls didn't. Their fairy tale dissolved into gunsmoke and revolutionary slogans. Edward II's awkward children. Let's drift back to medieval England for a different kind of disaster, this time with King Edward II, who reigned from 1307 to 1327. Edward is mostly remembered for being, let's say, distractible. He preferred hanging out with his male favorites rather than governing, or even acknowledging his wife Isabella, who happened to be the daughter of the King of France. Their children were caught in the middle of this domestic and political soap opera. The eldest son, also Edward, eventually became Edward III. But his path to the throne involved watching his mother and her lover, Roger Mortimer, basically overthrow his father. Not exactly a model childhood. Edward III was technically crowned while still a teenager. For a while, Mortimer ruled on his behalf, with Isabella enjoying her role as Queen Mother. But teenage Edward had apparently inherited just enough backbone to stage a coup of his own. He had Mortimer executed and sent Isabella into early retirement at a castle. So, Edward II's children survived, but only after navigating a family drama so convoluted it makes modern royal scandals look like mild domestic squabbles. Imagine your mom deposing your dad, then you deposing your mom's boyfriend. Truly a family tree pruned with an axe. The children of Charles IV of England. We'll stay in England for a moment, because the 17th century also provides some rather bedtime-friendly chaos. King Charles IV, the one who liked to believe in the divine right of kings just a little too much, lost his throne and his head during the English Civil War. His children's lives became a patchwork of exile, fear, and scrambling for protection. The eldest son, Charles II, fled abroad and lived in various courts, charming his way through Europe while surviving mostly on promises. When he eventually returned as king after the Restoration, he never quite lost the habit of wandering into other people's palaces and staying a little too long. Another son, James, ended up ruling later as James II, though his reign also ended badly with the Glorious Revolution. The daughters had varied fates, shuffled between relatives like fragile political tokens. One particularly sad case was Henry, Duke of Gloucester. He was only 8 when his father was executed, and he spent much of his childhood in captivity. When he was finally freed and allowed to join his family in exile, he promptly died of smallpox at age 20. A lifetime of waiting, followed by no life at all. So yes, the children of Charles IV demonstrate the essential truth of royal overthrows. Even if you survive, you don't really thrive. Napoleon's only son. And now, let's drift over to France, because no collection of children of fallen rulers is complete without Napoleon's ill-fated boy. Napoleon Bonaparte had one legitimate son, Napoleon II, grandly titled the King of Rome at birth. That sounds impressive, except he never actually ruled anything. When Napoleon was defeated and exiled, his son was quietly removed from France and raised in Austria under the care of his grandfather, the Austrian emperor. There, the child was renamed Franz and basically treated as a decorative hostage. He grew up frail, coughing his way through palatial corridors, never allowed to return to France, never allowed to be anything other than a reminder of what could have been. He died of tuberculosis at just 21, a life that began with fanfare and a crown, only to end with a whisper in a foreign palace. His father had promised him an empire. He got a lonely sick room instead. The general pattern. So, what happened to the children of famous kings after they were overthrown? Well, as you might have noticed, the answer is rarely pleasant. They became missing persons mysteries, tragic martyrs, pawns in political schemes, or decorative exiles coughing into lace handkerchiefs. A few were luckier, like Edward III, who managed to carve out his own destiny after family drama. But for most, their lives were defined not by what they inherited, but by what was taken away. It's a reminder that being born into royalty wasn't always the fairy tale it looked like. Sometimes, it meant you were the last loose end after your father's story had ended. And loose ends tend not to survive long in history. So let's drift quietly now, away from these forgotten royal nurseries and toward another chapter of dynastic misfortune. Our next wander through history will take us into stranger territory still. Hey everyone, still awake? Or perhaps half drifting by now? Either way, let's soften the light even more and slip into another topic. Tonight, we're leaving royal nurseries behind and wandering instead through medieval streets, monasteries, and, unfortunately, some very questionable hospitals. We're looking at how people in the Middle Ages understood and treated mental illness. Spoiler, they didn't. Madness as divine or demonic. In the medieval worldview, there wasn't really a category for mental health as we think of it today. Instead, people believed madness came from one of two places. The first option was the divine. God might strike someone with visions, wild speech, or strange behavior as a form of punishment, or occasionally as a blessing. Prophets, saints, and mystics often behaved in ways that looked suspiciously like untreated schizophrenia, but were hailed as holy. The second option was the devil. Possession, curses, or witchcraft explained everything from erratic mood swings to catatonic states. And naturally, if the devil was the cause, the solution was not therapy, but exorcism. Priests muttering Latin over a very confused and probably terrified individual. So you see, in the medieval world, you were either a saint or a sinner. Rarely anything in between. The four humors. But medieval Europe did have its own form of science. The ancient Greek idea of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was still the dominant medical model. If someone was melancholic, doctors assumed they had too much black bile. Too excitable? Obviously an excess of yellow bile. The solution was to balance these fluids, which meant purging, bloodletting, vomiting, or being force-fed herbs that tasted like lawn clippings. Not exactly soothing treatment. Imagine suffering from depression, and your doctor decides the cure is draining a pint of blood out of your arm while reminding you it's for your own good. That was medieval psychiatry. Care or containment. When mental illness became too disruptive, families often had two options. One was to hide the afflicted relative at home, keeping them out of public sight. The other was to deposit them in a monastic hospital. Medieval hospitals weren't like our hospitals today. They were more like hostels with a side of prayer. Staffed mostly by monks and nuns, they focused on feeding, sheltering, and praying for patient souls, not on curing them. Which is another way of saying, if you were mentally ill, you were essentially warehoused, not treated. Some institutions did attempt specific remedies, cold baths, chains, or herbal sedatives, but just as often, patients were left in locked cells, out of sight and out of mind. The natural fools. One interesting wrinkle in all this was how medieval society treated people who seemed permanently simple-minded or eccentric. These individuals were sometimes called natural fools. Instead of being locked away, many became tolerated or even cherished as part of courtly life. Kings and nobles often kept fools or jesters around. Some were professional performers, but others were simply individuals with intellectual disabilities who were seen as charmingly odd. It was believed that fools spoke with a kind of innocence, sometimes even divine truth. So in a strange twist, if your mental state made you amusing rather than disruptive, you could end up with a secure job at court, paid to wear motley and tell jokes instead of chained in a hospital. Not an ideal career path, but perhaps better than most alternatives. Religious fixes. Since most explanations for madness were spiritual, the treatments were as well. Pilgrimages to holy shrines were popular prescriptions. A family might drag their disturbed relative across half of Europe, hoping a saint's relic could set them right. Some saints were especially associated with curing madness. Saint Dymphna, for example, became the patron saint of the mentally ill after her own tragic death. Pilgrims flocked to her shrine in Belgium, hoping her intercession would help. Exorcisms, fasting, confession, and holy water were all standard parts of the medieval therapeutic toolkit. And naturally, none of these addressed the actual underlying conditions. When madness was useful, we should also remember that in some contexts, madness wasn't seen as entirely negative. Certain mystics, often women, were revered for their ecstatic visions and bizarre behavior. Take Marjorie Kempe, an Englishwoman who lived in the 14th and 15th centuries. She had loud, uncontrollable fits of weeping in church, which annoyed pretty much everyone, including priests. But she also dictated what is considered the first autobiography in English, describing her visions and struggles. Some thought she was divinely inspired. Others thought she was simply mad, and yet she carved out a space for herself, balancing precariously between sainthood and scandal. The darker side. Of course, not all medieval approaches were gentle. When illness was seen as demonic, harsher treatments followed. Some sufferers were beaten to drive out the devil. Others were chained in dark rooms. And some, tragically, were accused of witchcraft. Women especially might find their symptoms reinterpreted as evidence of a pact with the devil. So while a noble family might protect their eccentric relative, poorer women often bore the brunt of suspicion. Their madness could become a death sentence. The long sleep of reason. What's striking when you drift through all these cases is how long it took for anything resembling modern psychiatry to emerge. Medieval society had no real category for mental health. The sick body could be treated. The sick mind was a mystery best left to priests, saints, and maybe a good bleeding or two. It's only in the Renaissance and Enlightenment that ideas began shifting, slowly, unevenly, toward medical explanations. But through much of the Middle Ages, madness remained either holy, cursed, or inconvenient. A strange comfort. And yet, as strange as these views seem, there's something oddly human about them. Families tried, awkwardly, clumsily, to help. Communities found roles for people who didn't quite fit. Religious faith offered hope, however misplaced. For every dark tale of chains and exorcisms, there are also stories of fools protected at court, mystics who found meaning in their visions, and patients quietly cared for in monasteries. It wasn't treatment, not really. but it was survival. So if you find yourself lying awake tonight, brain buzzing in inconvenient ways, take some small comfort. At least nobody is reaching for a leech or dragging you on pilgrimage to Belgium. We've made progress. Sort of. And with that, let's drift to the next topic, because naturally, we can't leave out one of the strangest social roles of the medieval world, the executioner, and what he did with his free time. Hey again, if you're still awake, congratulations. If you've drifted off and woken up halfway through this, don't worry. We're in no rush. Tonight's journey has no deadlines. So let's talk about a peculiar profession, one that was both essential and despised, the medieval executioner. These men, because of course they were men, spent only a fraction of their time swinging swords, axes, or ropes. Contrary to Hollywood, the average town didn't have a beheading every Tuesday. So the real question is, what did executioners do when they weren't killing? The answer is both surprisingly ordinary and faintly absurd. The social outcasts. First, let's get one thing straight. Executioners weren't popular. People wanted them around, but also not too close. They were necessary but considered impure. Many towns forced them to live on the edge of the community, sometimes literally outside the walls, because no one wanted to bump into the guy who hanged your cousin while you were buying bread. This meant executioners had to carve out odd niches in society. They weren't welcome in polite company, but they had skills people couldn't ignore. Butchers, healers, and dog catchers. One of the strangest ironies of the job is that executioners often doubled as butchers. After all, they were handy with sharp blades and not squeamish about blood. Some towns actually required the executioner to slaughter animals, since nobody else wanted the unclean task. Even more unexpectedly, executioners sometimes became healers. Yes, healers. People believed their knowledge of anatomy, learned from, well, cutting people open, gave them medical expertise. They might set broken bones, lance boils, or brew herbal remedies. And because society loved to pile indignity on indignity, executioners were also tasked with dirty civic jobs, cleaning latrines, disposing of animal carcasses, and yes, catching stray dogs. So the man who could decapitate a nobleman on Friday might be rounding up barking strays on Monday. A glamorous career it was not. The perks of the job. Oddly enough, being despised came with certain benefits. Executioners were often allowed to take whatever clothes or possessions a condemned person left behind. This made them skilled recyclers, in a rather grim way. Some even took the bodies themselves, selling bones or fat for medical concoctions. Human fat was a prized ingredient in certain ointments, believed to help with everything from arthritis to bruises. Morbid, yes. Profitable also, yes. Executioners also had immunity from some laws. Since nobody else wanted the job, towns gave them unusual freedoms. They might get free beer at inns, or a cut of market taxes, or first pick at confiscated goods. Which is another way of saying their payment plan was a mixture of salary, loot, and don't worry about it. Family business executioner wasn't usually a job you applied for. More often it was inherited. If your father was an executioner, congratulations. You probably were too. Towns wanted to keep the role contained, almost like quarantining a disease within one unlucky family. Some dynasties of executioners lasted for generations, passing down their tools and their awkward social stigma. Children of executioners often had trouble marrying outside their profession, so they married other executioners' children. A grim little social circle, built entirely on sharp edges and bad reputations. A reputation with the ladies. And yet, despite being outcasts, executioners sometimes developed reputations as oddly attractive. There was a certain dangerous glamour in being the man who dealt death. Some women were drawn to the role, in the same way people today romanticize rock stars or criminals. In Germany, executioners were known to have mistresses who were impressed by their strength and feared authority. Imagine explaining that to your parents. "Yes, mother, I'm dating the man who chopped off Uncle Hans's hand last month. He's very good with an axe." The psychological side. Now, what about the executioners themselves? How did they feel about the job? Some embraced it with grim pride. They saw themselves as instruments of justice, carrying out divine or civic duty. Others seemed to compartmentalize, focusing on the practical side. A job's a job, and it pays the bills. But there are plenty of records of executioners drinking heavily, isolating themselves, or expressing deep unease. After all, killing for a living isn't exactly conducive to restful sleep. Many coped by leaning into superstition, performing rituals before executions, or carrying charms to ward off the guilt. The executioner's craft. When they weren't killing, executioners also practiced. Because if you're going to chop off someone's head in one stroke, you don't want to miss. Training involved chopping wood, slaughtering animals, and occasionally, disturbingly, working with corpses. The skill was valued. A clean, quick execution was seen as merciful. A botched one was shameful and could earn the executioner a beating from the crowd, which, you'll notice, meant that towns despised executioners, right up until they really needed them to be precise. So in their downtime, executioners were like grim athletes, keeping their swing in shape. Odd friendships. Executioners often fraternized with the very criminals they were hired to kill. Before an execution, it was customary for the condemned and the executioner to share a drink together. A strange little ritual of bonding before the blade. Sometimes the criminal would even tip the executioner, begging for a swift death. Executioners accepted bribes for this, another perk of the job. So you see, execution wasn't just a profession, it was a bizarre form of customer service. Legends and myths. Over time, executioners picked up mythic reputations. Some were said to know secret herbs or to have power over life and death beyond the scaffold. People whispered that touching an executioner's hand could bring luck or misfortune, depending on the mood of the storyteller. This paradox meant that while society shunned them, individuals sometimes sought them out privately, hoping their strange aura carried some supernatural benefit. It's hard not to see the irony. Public disgust, private fascination. A life between worlds. So what did executioners do when they weren't killing? They butchered animals, healed wounds, rounded up dogs, recycled corpses, drank heavily, and lived on society's margins. They were essential, but unwelcome. Feared, but also occasionally admired. Their lives were a tangle of contradiction, half healer, half hangman. It wasn't a comfortable role, but it was stable. And in the Middle Ages, stability counted for something, even if it came with bloodstains. So let's drift away now, leaving behind the executioner's awkward little cottage at the edge of town, and let's float into another kind of survival story, one lived by ordinary people during one of history's darkest plagues. Because the Black Death was not survived by kings and generals alone. It was endured by farmers, bakers, and children with strange good luck charms stuffed in their pockets. Hey everyone, let's take a slow breath. Settle a little deeper into the pillows. Tonight we're slipping back to the 14th century, when Europe faced its most notorious guest, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague swept through towns, villages, and cities, killing somewhere between a third and half of the population. Entire families vanished. Fields went untended. Priests gave last rites until their voices gave out. And yet, some people survived. Not kings or generals in their castles, but ordinary folks. Farmers, bakers, merchants, even shepherds. Tonight we'll drift through their survival strategies, which ranged from vaguely practical to wildly bizarre. The herbal arsenal. One of the simplest strategies was herbs. People believed foul air, miasma, caused the plague. So they carried posies, sprigs of rosemary, or bags of dried flowers, hoping the sweet smells would protect them. Doctors even stuffed beak-shaped masks with herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges. Yes, those famous plague doctor costumes were less terrifying cosplay and more portable potpourri. Naturally, they didn't work. But at least everyone smelled like thyme. Some families burned herbs inside their homes. Others wore necklaces of garlic or onions. If you're wondering, yes, medieval Europe often smelled like a badly ventilated soup kitchen. Quarantine and running away. Another approach was simple: run. Wealthy families often fled cities for the countryside, hoping fresh air and distance would save them. The problem was, they sometimes carried the plague with them, turning safe villages into not-so-safe ones. The city of Ragusa, in modern Croatia, tried something new in 1377: quarantine. Ships had to wait 30 days before unloading passengers, later extended to 40. The Italian word for 40, quaranta, gave us the term quarantine. Of course, this was after half of Europe had already died, but better late than never. Strange diets. Some survivors swore by unusual diets. Certain manuals suggested avoiding fruit, which was thought to rot inside the body and cause disease. Others recommended eating dry, plain foods: bread, porridge, beans. Wine, naturally, was considered medicinal. Some drank heavily, arguing that plague germs couldn't survive in a thoroughly soaked body. Others believed in moderation. No feasting, no indulgence, just careful balance. So you had two survival camps, those fasting quietly and those stumbling drunkenly through the streets. History doesn't say which group fared better. Amulets and odd charms. When medicine failed, superstition stepped in. People wore amulets with prayers written on parchment. Some carried charms made of amber or coral, believed to ward off illness. In Germany, it was common to carry a dead toad in your pocket because someone decided toads absorbed poison. In France, people rubbed themselves with vinegar and herbs or hung gems around their necks for protection. It wasn't science, but when half your neighbors were dropping dead, you clutched whatever talisman you could find. Community survival. Not everyone could flee or afford charms. For ordinary villagers, survival often meant cooperation. Families shared food, helped bury the dead, and tried to keep farms running. In some towns, neighbors abandoned one another entirely. In others, communities banded together, forming small support networks. Records show villages where everyone pooled resources, taking turns guarding wells or tending animals. So while the plague shattered many communities, it also forged resilience in others. Flagellants and faith religion was everywhere in plague survival. Some believed the Black Death was God's punishment for sin. In response, groups of flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves to atone. Crowds gathered to watch, half horrified, half fascinated. Others flocked to churches, praying for saints to intervene. Pilgrimages increased. Holy relics were in high demand. If someone claimed to have a fragment of a saint's finger bone, desperate townsfolk lined up to kiss it. Of course, gathering in large groups for mass prayers only spread the disease faster. But faith offered comfort, even as it made things worse. Everyday precautions. Ordinary people also came up with smaller, practical tricks. Some closed their windows, stuffed with rags soaked in vinegar. Others lit fires inside houses, hoping smoke would drive away the sickness. Bathing was debated. Some said it opened pores, letting disease in. Others thought washing with vinegar was protective. The safest option seemed to be, don't get too close to anyone else, which of course is still good advice. The survivor's luck. Ultimately, many survivors weren't saved by herbs, diets, or prayers. They were simply lucky. Some had genetic resistance. Others lived in isolated places where the plague never reached. There are accounts of entire villages spared by accident. A change in wind, a missed trade route, or just blind chance meant some communities remained untouched. Survival often had less to do with what people did, and more with where they happened to be when the plague passed by. Life after. For those who lived, survival brought its own challenges. Fields lay empty, families were gone, and entire economies collapsed. Wages rose because workers were scarce, giving peasants more bargaining power, but trauma lingered. Art and literature became obsessed with death. The danse macabre motif appeared everywhere, paintings of skeletons leading people in grim dances. Because once you've seen half your town buried, you don't exactly bounce back overnight. A strange kind of resilience. So, how did ordinary people survive the Black Death? They ran, they prayed, they carried garlic, toads, and relics. They burned herbs and drank wine. They leaned on neighbors or abandoned them. Most of it didn't work. Some of it probably made things worse. But woven through it all is the very human impulse to try something, anything, when faced with the unexplainable. And despite everything, enough people survived to rebuild, repopulate, and eventually, centuries later, complain about taxes again, which is perhaps the most human survival trait of all. So let's drift now, away from plague-ridden streets and smoky cottages. We've wandered through vanished heirs, fragile minds, and awkward executioners. And now we've survived the plague alongside bakers and shepherds. Next time, we'll drift into yet another gallery of dynastic oddities. Because royalty, as you've seen, rarely managed normal family lives. And sometimes their pettiness was stranger than any plague. Close your eyes and picture a grand medieval hall. Tapestries hang from the walls. Courtiers bow as a king enters, jewels glittering on his robes. But look closer. The king's brother is scowling. His cousin is plotting in the shadows. His wife is rolling her eyes. Royal life was less majestic harmony and more Thanksgiving dinner with swords. Let's explore the pettiness, rivalries, and dysfunctional families that shaped kingdoms, and sometimes destroyed them. Feuding siblings, royal rivalries. Take Richard the Lionheart and King John of England. Richard was the heroic crusader, loved by legends. John? Well, John was the villain of Robin Hood, but before John earned his reputation, he spent years scheming against his brother. When Richard was captured on his way back from the Crusades, John didn't exactly rush to pay his ransom. In fact, he quietly hoped Richard might not make it home. Unfortunately for John, Richard did, and he wasn't amused. Sibling rivalry in royal families wasn't pillow fights and stolen toys. It was backstabbing alliances, armies raised, and castles set on fire. Petty marriages. Royal marriages were supposed to secure alliances. But sometimes, they just made everything worse. Consider Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Their marriage began with pomp, but soon soured. Louis was pious and timid. Eleanor was bold and ambitious. When they joined the Second Crusade, they spent more time arguing than fighting Turks. Eventually, their marriage was annulled. Eleanor promptly married Henry Plantagenet, soon to be Henry II of England. Suddenly, the lands she brought as dowry shifted from France to England. In one stroke, Louis lost half his kingdom because his ex-wife remarried. Petty? Absolutely, but also geopolitically disastrous. Royals behaving badly. Let's drift to Russia for Ivan the Terrible. His reign was already bloody, but his personal life was equally stormy. During a heated argument, Ivan struck his son, the heir to the throne, with his staff, killing him. It was a crime born of rage, paranoia, and dysfunction. Ivan reportedly collapsed in grief afterward. But the damage was done. The dynasty weakened, and Russia plunged into crisis after his death. In this case, royal dysfunction wasn't just petty. It reshaped an empire. Feuding courts, queens, and kings weren't the only ones misbehaving. Their courts often mirrored the same dysfunction. At Versailles under Louis XIV, nobles competed obsessively for small favors. Who got to hand the king his gloves? Who poured his wine? Who stood closer to him in the Hall of Mirrors? These petty competitions weren't just silly, they were deliberate. Louis XIV used them to keep nobles distracted and dependent, too busy squabbling over who tucked in the king's chair to plot rebellion. Dysfunction, in this case, was a form of control. Mothers and sons. Royal families also had notoriously tense parent-child relationships. Catherine de' Medici of France loved power almost as much as she loved her sons. She manipulated them from behind the throne, whispering advice, playing favorites, and sometimes undermining them to maintain her own influence. It was less maternal guidance and more Game of Thrones with family dinners. Her meddling helped fuel France's brutal wars of religion, showing how personal dysfunction could spill into national bloodshed. The Spanish Habsburgs, dysfunction by design. No gallery of royal dysfunction is complete without the Habsburgs. Obsessed with keeping their empire pure, they married cousins for generations. The result? Charles II of Spain, often called the Bewitched. Charles had severe physical and mental disabilities. He couldn't chew properly, struggled to speak, and was often ill. His reign was weak and chaotic, and when he died childless in 1700, Europe plunged into the War of Spanish Succession. In this case, dysfunction wasn't pettiness. It was the slow genetic collapse of an entire dynasty. Kings who quit sometimes. Dysfunction meant simply walking away. King Edward VIII of Britain shocked the world in 1936 when he abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. His family, and much of the political establishment, was horrified. Imagine giving up centuries of crown and empire for love. To some it was romantic. To others, it was reckless selfishness. Either way, it exposed cracks in the supposedly untouchable royal image. Pettiness beyond thrones. It wasn't always wars and abdications. Sometimes royal pettiness was just small. King George IV of Britain spent fortunes on clothes and parties while mocking his own wife, Caroline of Brunswick. Their marriage was so toxic that during his coronation, he literally barred her from Westminster Abbey. She had to bang on the doors, demanding to be let in. The doors stayed shut. That's not just dysfunction, that's royal-level pettiness. Why the dysfunction matters. All these rivalries, bad marriages, and petty feuds remind us royalty were human. Their dysfunctions weren't just gossip. They shaped wars, alliances, and empires. A jealous brother could plunge kingdoms into chaos. A bitter divorce could redraw borders. A dysfunctional dynasty could trigger global wars. The crown glittered, but underneath it was fragile, cracked by egos, betrayals, and personal grudges. The strange comfort of dysfunction. There's something oddly comforting in these tales. Even the most powerful people in history couldn't escape family drama. They sulked, argued, and made mistakes that echo through centuries. If you've ever fought with a sibling, rolled your eyes at a parent, or dreaded a tense dinner, well, congratulations. You've lived like royalty. Without the armies, of course. So let's leave the royal halls for tonight. We've seen crowns slip, families fracture, and empires stumble over petty quarrels. Next, we'll drift into another shadowed corner of history, where myths and monsters lurked just beyond the torchlight. Because before science explained the world, people filled the dark with stories.